Good evening, everyone. Guests, Commissioner, and our esteemed panelists from the Department of Planning, thank you very much for being here with us this evening. It is 6:06 p.m. The Baltimore City Community Relations Commission investigative hearing with the Department of Planning on May 3rd, 2023 is called to order. Our agenda today has been shared between Planning and our Office of Equity. We will begin with opening statements. In attendance with us today on behalf of the Community Relations Commission, we will be joined shortly by our chair, Sheridan Todd Yeary. I am the Secretary of the Commission, Nadine Finnegan-Carr, and I am joined by Commissioner Ronaldo Evangelista. To my right, your left on the screen for those of you watching on Charm TV or joining us via WebEx. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This is the fourth in a series of hearings that we have been holding this fiscal year. In our duties as a Community Relations Commission. In this role, what we have been doing is getting the lay of the land as far as various city agencies on behalf of the overall Baltimore City community, having an understanding of the role that the agencies play, bringing that information to the wider community, as well as getting an understanding of the work that they do with relation specifically to equity and civil rights. That being said, what we plan on doing this afternoon and evening is getting some understanding of the current processes in place by the Department of Planning, not only related to equity and civil rights, but specifically with relations to their current efforts in planning as related to neighborhoods, community, and historic preservation, which are their primary mission. Looking forward to hearing from them. We have several members of the Department of Planning with us online via WebEx, and we also have Director Chris Ryer present with us in the City Hall at this present moment. I am going to turn it over momentarily for Commissioner Evangelista if you have anything else to add.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome. We do appreciate you coming here today. We do appreciate your service and your commitment to the city. We are looking forward to hearing actually how you're going to continue building a Baltimore that is diverse, sustainable, as well as thriving throughout the neighborhood. So we do appreciate you being here.
Right. That being said, I just want to confirm if any other commissioners joined us via WebEx. All right, so we will go ahead and jump right into the Department of Planning's opening statements at this time.
Thank you, Commission. My name is Chris Ryer. I'm the Director of Planning. And on the WebEx, we have Stephanie Smith, Assistant Director. I'm Sarah Parnillo, I'm Director of Policy and Analysis. I believe I have Policy and Data Analysis. And Kristen Ahern, who coordinates our capital budget. Tonight, I was going to give you a brief overview of the department. Assistant Director Smith will then dig down on our equity works in sort of in a holistic world. And then Sarah and Kristen will highlight the capital budgeting, our equity work in the capital budget, which is one of our more significant things. So first, let me give you a brief overview of the department. It's a very old department, goes back to the 1930s. Charter function was to regulate land use. So the department historically has been very focused on the physical nature of the city, but it's much more than that now. And I can say, because I interact with other planning directors and other large cities in the country, it's a very strong and relatively powerful planning department. And a couple reasons for that. One is, unlike most planning departments, it does control the capital budget for the city, which gives it influence over the operating agencies. It also, going all the way back to the 60s, talk about an equity initiative there, we created one of the first departments in the country to create a vigorous community planning division within the department. That's how I started. I came up as an intern in that. I think I'm the first for that. But that really grounds the neighborhood in the neighborhoods, and we've expanded that over the years so that we have more fully, I'd say almost a third of the department is now in the community planning and revitalization division. Historically, I think we have a lot going for us. Personally, I have worked in this department 3 different times since 1986 for first dozen years as a community planner. I came back as a head of community planning and deputy director, and came back 4 years ago as the director. Department has 7 divisions. I want to start with the administrative division. We have sort of 2 roles. Administrative division is the director and 2 assistant directors, an HR director and a finance director, as well as a couple people that help with the Board of Estimates and the reception area. So we really have 2 roles. One is to support the staff. That's what we're there for. To make them effective planners for the city of Baltimore. And the other role is to implement the agenda of the administration. So that's a fairly straightforward role. I want to emphasize our commitment to supporting the staff and to supporting the administration. Now, the divisions of the department include the community planning and revitalization. That assigns, I believe it's 11 planners to 11 planning districts around the city. They're deliberately not the same as council districts or anybody else's district for that matter. They are an independent entity, and they are there to provide advice and assistance on planning issues to community groups. I'll start with that. We maintain a roster of community associations, which is entirely voluntary and self-directed. We pass no judgment on that. We do ask questions about their outreach and their inclusiveness. They don't have to answer them. But we rely on our community planners to know the neighborhoods and know the groups, and they are our eyes and our contact with the city and the citizens in the city. They also operate a couple of programs. We stood up when the 21st Century School Program began. We committed the department to showing particularly the state and the school system how we were leveraging that funding and how we were supporting the schools within the community. We created something called the Inspire program, and it's really how we work with the community around the school to improve the environment around the school. We also that division also supports something called the Green Network Plan. Green Network Plan works in highly distressed neighborhoods where there is no housing market, and hence there is a large amount of demolition. And demolition often increases the safety of a neighborhood to remove a vacant building, but it still leaves a vacant lot. And that lot can become a liability if that's not managed. So we have a team working on the Green Network Plan very specifically, sort of even more intensively with the neighborhoods than even the community planners typically work. We also are supporting, one of the reasons I came back to the city was Department of Housing Community Development, which is now separate from the Housing Authority, has a community development strategy. They don't have community planners on their team, so we act as sort of the neighborhood contact liaison to implement the housing community development strategy. So that's a brief summary of the Community Planning Division. But we also support 3 commissions. We support the Planning Commission, originally created to regulate land use in the city. We support the Commission on Historic and Architectural Preservation, commonly known as CHAP, which regulates the preservation of older buildings in the city. And now, since 2008, our newest commission is the Sustainability Commission, which was created, again, in 2008. And so there's a division called Land Use and Urban Design that supports the Planning Commission. There's a division to support the CHAP Commission, and there's a Sustainability Office that supports the Sustainability Commission. In general, what they have in common is we are regulating land use. The difference with the creation of the Sustainability Commission is that we are regulating a number of environmental regulations, whether they be local, state, or federal, critical area, forest conservation, the like. So there's a regulatory piece in all of those. I would say they also, as we can talk today, there's a lot of policy work going on in those divisions too, but their original creation was to regulate land use. Sarah also heads our policy and data. They do mapping. We do a pretty sophisticated capacity for GIS and mapping in the city. We support the census effort, the strategy, the outreach strategy for the city every 10 years, and it supports the capital budgeting process. We also, we back up, the Office of Sustainability has a pretty unique history of incubating efforts in the city. And one effort it incubated is the Food Policy and Planning Division of the city, which we were one of the first cities in the country to actually have a food policy staff. And believe me, that was invaluable during a pandemic. As you can imagine, in any emergency situation, by the way, we do the emergency planning for the city in the Office of Sustainability, all the FEMA planning that's required every 5 years. But you can imagine most emergency planning around a hurricane, for example, is based on bringing people together and sheltering them from whatever the emergency is. Well, the one thing you can't do in a pandemic is bring people together. You have to keep them apart. So how do you feed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that no longer have access to school lunches, no longer have access to rec centers, no longer have access to senior centers? That team of 3 people they worked with the convention center, the National Guard, they created a distribution system in 10 days at the onset of the pandemic. So I think I've gotten all the divisions, the community planning, land use, CHAP, sustainability, and food policy, along with the administrative section, create the structure of the department. We, as a department, I'm going to let Stephanie expand on this, but the staff, this was before I was there and before Stephanie was there, the staff organized around equity issues in 2015, actually slightly before Freddie Gray, which is even more astounding to me. And the department has put together a long-lasting now and pretty sophisticated strategy that Stephanie's going to go into, but I want to emphasize a couple parts for my role as the director. During COVID, we lost about 1/3 of our department. And to be perfectly clear, our budget is 95% people. We don't have trucks, and we don't dig holes, or we don't. It's our budget is our people. That is our we're like the finance department in that way. So investment in our people is as a director, my number one priority, and I think our leadership team would all agree with that. So we had this big turnover during COVID for a wide variety of reasons. There were retirements. It coincided with new administration in Washington, and some people that had left the administration in Washington went back to the administration in Washington. That problem, I think the Equity Committee had done their homework, and we had developed a strategy to diversify our workforce, which was not very diverse. So it was ready to go when we had this big COVID turnover. And we had an incredibly dedicated HR director, a single parent, among other things. And we implemented a multi-pronged strategy. We reached out to every HABCU that before we did that, we revised our criteria for hiring. We broadened our criteria. You didn't need to have a planning degree anymore. You could be a community organizer. You could have a real estate background or any number of different backgrounds. Then we went to every HABCU in the country with a relevant degree program. We formed a special relationship with Morgan here at home. And we developed relationships. We had a spreadsheet with every outreach office at Morgan, all HBCUs, and the local colleges that had those kinds of relevant programs. As compared to historically, they were all with Ivy Leagues. So we really broadened that. And with a pretty aggressive hiring program, we achieved our goal. And I think the staff is much younger and much more diverse than it was. It's pleasant to have this group of go-getters on board now. As we were talking at the beginning of this, this all happened during COVID, so we have a third of the staff that have never worked in the office. So we've had to really work. We have a committee of staff to work to do the team building that's so important to this kind of work, and to educate ourselves on ongoing efforts, and to sort of keep up with what everybody else is doing, both in the department and in city government. So that's where I was going to leave it, turn it over to Stephanie. She will probably start with our definition of equity. It's much more sophisticated than most people's. I like Dr. Santalisis's. Her definition, give every child what they need. But I think we've taken that a step beyond, and I think that's very important when we talk about generational equity and a capital budget, which looks 20 years ahead. I think that's a fairly unique space that we work in. But Stephanie will expand on our planning academy, the numerous things we've done to go way beyond community planning now, to get ourselves out into the communities and to reach people that have not been reached before. So if Stephanie's
Thank you, Director Ryer. Before we get Director Smith on, I don't know, we've been joined by our chair, Yuri, so I don't know, Chair Yuri, if you wanted to at least introduce yourself, and I am also turning over the gavel to our chair as I opened up the meeting, just so that you know, at 6:06 p.m.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Good evening, colleagues. Mr. Director, my apologies for my tardiness. Thank you for beginning in my absence. This is an important discussion tonight. I'm sure, as you would expect, the work that you do as we are in the waning days of the actual national emergency declaration, which I think expires sometime next week, and what it means for moving forward, along with a number of the allocations that we see coming down the federal pipeline, and then looking at the historical issues. I'm glad you touch on the equity conversation, and we're looking forward to our former colleague to share with us what that planning looks like, because it is an area of concern. The historical inequities that are pointed out in some of your available documents on the department's website, I think, speak to the issue. I think the concern or the questions that the commission has is, where are we kind of in real time when we talk about the disparities across the city? And what are we doing to make sure that with this new tranche of infrastructure money and all of these federal dollars that have been put in the pipeline during COVID, how do we make sure that it does not just further exacerbate the health and wealth gaps that we already see in the city?
Okay, so Assistant Director Smith will give you an overview of our equity work, and then, to your point, our capital budgeting staff will zero in on the infrastructure discussion. We'll walk you through a process where we kicked off with hiring an outside consultant to do an assessment. I brought copies, like a summary of that, but we also publish a report every year, an update. So we've done 3, I think, since that initial assessment. We'll be working on our 4th this year. So I have some of that with us, but we'll be able to give you a more detailed explanation of that.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
There is Assistant Director Madden Smith. Good evening to you. We're glad to see you. We miss you on the commission. You escaped us as you were moving into service down in Annapolis, and so we hope that you're well. Good to see you. You have the floor.
So much, Mr. Chair, and also good evening, commissioners. It's great to be back, albeit virtually, with my friends at the CRC. For the record, I'm Assistant Director Stephanie Smith, and I'm here to discuss the equity components of the work that we do at the Department of Planning. To set the tone, as Director Ryer mentioned, I want to first read the agency definition of equity that we co-created as an agency, and it reads as thus: an equitable Baltimore addresses the needs and aspirations of its diverse population and meaningfully engages residents through inclusive and collaborative processes to expand access to power and resources. And I want to reread those last few words: to expand access to power and resources. One of the reasons why those last few words were critically important to our agency to have leading kind of the frame for our equity work is that equity work from a governmental or major institutional standpoint can't be simply telling people what you're going to do to them or their communities. It really has to be about ensuring that they have the information, the data, the perspective, and the nuance necessary to self-actualize what they want for their community, to be able to engage and advocate in the most strategic ways, and to, quite frankly, equip the government to not simply assume what people need, but be able to be in a very productive partnership with communities about what it is that they've always needed and what they would like to see happen in the future. And so beyond that framing of equity from our agency's perspective, I wanted to reiterate that the equity committee that was established by our agency predates both my tenure with the agency as well as Director Ryer. And it also was initiated prior to the unfortunate actions that gave rise to the uprising of 2015. If anything, the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent uprising only further committed staff to basically not just having a generic sense of equity or inequity, but wanting to ensure that they fully understood the historical context within Baltimore that gave rise to present day inequity, and then endeavored to devise a strategy around how you unplan the very systemic inequities that were carefully planned over not only many decades, but several generations of leadership across both local, state, and federal governments. And so for our part to play, we look to an equity lens that was created by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. As Director Ryer mentioned, we were not only one of the first cities in the nation to have a food policy and planning team, we were also one of the first major cities in this nation to have a sustainability division. And as such, we are a member of USDN, and we found their four-part equity lens to be both accessible to our staff and to the public writ large, but we also felt that it was straightforward enough that we could really use it as our priorities continue to expand and also refine at the same time. And so the four-part lens looks at structural equity, asking the question, what historic advantages or disadvantages have affected residents in a given community? Procedural equity, how are residents who have historically been excluded from processes, how are they being authentically included in implementation and planning and the evaluation of a proposed policy or project? And distributional equity is looking at where are power and resources going, not only within a geography, but also within a population. And as we all know, despite many changes in federal and local policies, we still are a city that is greatly defined by residential segregation. So the distribution of power across geography in many instances can also serve as a proxy for distribution of power across populations. And then lastly, transgenerational equity. What undue burdens are we placing on future generations of Baltimoreans as we make decisions that often will last not only a year or two, but in many instances, many decades into the future? In that regard, when we think about the work of an agency like planning, we are thinking about structures that people will have to grapple with, look at, or otherwise deal with for many years, or look at investments and how we are dealing with our land use reality. These are decisions that are not just felt by the people who make them, but also by their children and oftentimes their grandchildren into the future. So that four-part equity lens, coupled with our equity definition, was really the North Star for how we developed an equity action plan of our own. And I do want to reiterate, particularly for those who may be unaware, our equity action plan, the lens adoption, and the actual definition all predate the city's equity ordinance that was subsequently ratified by council, but was inspired by the organic works of the Department of Planning. One of the things to emphasize is that this is work that is, I said before, unplanning things that were very intentionally designed. And so we have 5 main goals, not in an order of priority, but just for recitation. The first goal is improve and increase the dialogue and connections between our agency and those communities that have been historically excluded and underserved in Baltimore. Goal 2 is to ensure that the planning department staff reflects the demographics of Baltimore City. And Director Ryer spoke a bit about the intentionality around having recruitment, retention, and all related aspects of HR really be strategic about ensuring that the pipeline for opportunities in our agency are first reflective of the demographics in order to get to the very outcome we seek. Third goal is using an equity lens to develop, revise, and evaluate policies. 4 is to use an equity lens to prioritize capital investments. You'll get a deeper dive into that in the subsequent presentation. And then lastly, we have to evaluate our agency's internal practices and policies in order to have public-facing plans and other products reflect equity, the actual ways we conduct business across our agency, among ourselves, and with other agencies across government must also reflect that same commitment to equity. It can't be something that's situational. It has to be something that permeates all the work that we do. And so when we thought about one of the ways we could address and improve connection between those who have been historically excluded from these processes and our agency, in 2013, we had piloted an actual planning academy that was funded in part by those who were greatly concerned about the transitions that were happening in East Baltimore and wanting to ensure that those communities situated nearby were aware of what was happening and could provide input in real time. As you can imagine, when an opportunity for community leaders to get deeper understanding and information is made available, there were people across the city who also wanted access to that opportunity. And so the seeds were planted then that there needed to be a more systematic way to deliver information to our residents about how they can participate and not only feel that planning and land use decisions were happening to them, but could be on the offense about what they want to see their communities look like and become. And so from that in 2018 was born the Baltimore Planning Academy. And what's really important about the Academy is that we look at the housing market typology, a product that we as an agency produce for the Department of Housing and Community Development that looks at the housing market strength of communities across the city. And we really wanted to center the community leader that was living in a part of our city that had a more stressed or distressed housing market. Because in many instances, communities in the city that are able to strategically and successfully traverse the land use and development system are no more aware of what to do, but can often afford to outsource the expertise. If that means hiring a zoning attorney, an engineer, or architect, some of our community associations are situated to do that. But many of the communities that are feeling great levels of housing market distress have community leaders that need these tools and they need to deploy them personally or with their own organizations themselves. And so we weighted applications that hailed from those weaker housing and more distressed housing markets to ensure that those who were receiving this information were those who not only needed it, but were going to deploy it and use it for the benefit of their community members. So to date, over 240 Baltimore City residents have completed the Baltimore Planning Academy, and some folks that may be known to you that have been successful graduates of this program include Lady Breon, who has birthed and has continued to lead the Baltimore Black Arts District in West Baltimore off of Pennsylvania Avenue. Bree Jones with Parity Homes, also in West Baltimore. And Regina Hammond, who's been doing amazing work with Rebuild Metro in Johnston Square. And so I wanted to highlight that one of the biggest challenges institutions like government, major stakeholders like universities and hospitals, when we say we want to partner with a community, particularly a community that's had limited support, what does partnership mean when one part of that potential partnership has way more in terms of resources and understanding of policies and procedures than the partner? And so the Baltimore Planning Academy was conceived as a way to ensure that community members aren't just being led by what major institutions are telling them, but they have their own ability to understand and further equip their members and neighbors to participate in these land use opportunities in a way that they feel a sense of agency and a sense of control, not just in a symbolic way, but in a practical way. And so beyond the Planning Academy, we realized that there are a lot of concerns that residents have about what they see as the city's prioritization of their community. And that can mean they're looking for a specific plan for their community, or sometimes a sense of what the priorities are going to be more broadly across an area. And so I want to put on your radar that subject to state law, all 24 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland must produce an updated comprehensive plan. Some people refer to these as master plans. It's essentially a similar concept. And Baltimore is currently in the midst of an update, and that's through the Plan Our Baltimore process. If you go to planourbaltimore.com, you can see the timeline for this process, as well as what public outreach has happened to date. We're currently in a drafting and kind of synthesizing stage of taking the considerable public input we've received from not only our community ambassadors, a series of focus groups, and a culminating fall conference to really hone in on not only the elements of a comp plan that are required under state law, but also to explain how some of the feedback we received from the public dovetails with the expression of our land use and master planning priorities for the next 10 years. So our goal is to have this finalized by the end of next year, consistent with state law. But I think why I want to put this on your radar is that every community, of which there's nearly 300 in Baltimore, may not have one abiding plan that encompasses everything that can happen in their community. But this master plan or comprehensive plan update gives a very important macro direction for where the city can go that will affect communities, developers, and those who are interested in what's happening all over the city, move in a direction that is not only one dictated by those who work in city government, but co-produced and conceived with the neighbors that we also serve. And in addition to that project, when you look at where our land use future is going, it will have a relationship to where we prioritize capital investments in terms of the city's, looking at priority, there's priority corridors, priority neighborhoods that can develop out of the comp plan process. And also there are some existing neighborhoods that are already part of a city prioritization project as neighborhood focus areas that when you combine that with the comp plan, it can really paint a picture of where Baltimore can be in the next decade. So I invite commissioners to participate in their personal capacity and public comment periods that will come in the fall of this year, but also to the ability you have, signal boost opportunities for those in your villages and networks to also participate in those public comments on drafts of the comp plan that will first be revealed in fall of this year. And so for me, I don't want to filibuster you, but I do want to mention that in addition to the Baltimore Planning Academy.com website, planourbaltimore.com website, on our Baltimore City Department of Planning website, we do have a summary of our equity actions to date. We're in the midst of a web update, so there's going to be some updating of that content over the summer, but that foundational set of documents and information that I shared at the onset of my presentation remains unchanged and can be referred to by anyone on the commission or staff at your leisure. But I think that one of the things that we've learned through this process in terms of challenges is that when you think about transgenerational equity, how often is that person under 40 at the table, under 30? School age. I think many of us are continuously challenged to ensure that our youngest stakeholders are not simply invited, but when they're there, they're actually given an opportunity to share their voice. Particularly when it comes to the comp plan, there is not a more transit-dependent demographic in our city than young people. And so in many ways, they are the most equipped to articulate not only the challenges of transit at the present, but the possibilities of what it can mean to enhance the quality of their lives moving forward. So that's just an example of something that I think is a persistent challenge that we're always checking ourselves around. Are we authentically including younger people, young adults, and children as appropriate in this work? Another thing that I think we're often I'm thinking about is that oftentimes when we come into this work around equity, we think we're going to just be starting with needing new ordinances, new laws. But for that second prong of the equity lens, procedural equity, I would say that is probably one of the most deeply meaningful and important parts of addressing inequity is procedural. How many things are we doing just reflexively because it's been custom? Because that's just how we've been doing it. Not because we're legally obligated to have the meeting at that unfortunate time, or we're legally obligated to have that meeting in a place that's hard to get to and not on the line of public transportation. But we have to interrupt and disrupt some of the norms that aren't really governed by law, but just by custom, and ensure that our policies are providing opportunities for people to be present. So that meant for us making sure, can we make sure food, even if it's a light snack, are available at most public-facing things we're doing, just to show that level of respect that someone is taking that time to be there. Some type of provision of food can sometimes show that respect from government to the public, that we're going to make sure that you can at least be comfortable as you take time from your personal life to help us better serve you. We also are, we have a committee that's been looking at ways that we can take the staff reports that we create for all of the standing commissions that the director mentioned to you and incorporate equity observations so that there can be a more systematic way for commissioners to at least evaluate some metrics that maybe would otherwise not organically just show up in a traditional staff report. So we worked with our staff that were most readily involved in the authoring of these types of reports, and they pulled together a way to memorialize some of those observations in a more systematic way, so that as people refer to those types of public documents over time, they would know where to look to get that information about demographic reality or other, tidbits that would be, it would paint a more full picture of whatever the issue is at hand, irrespective of which commission, the matter is being brought before. And so this type of kind of ongoing self-reflection, looking at what works, doesn't work, revisiting. I think the work of equity is not a straight line, because just because you think you're doing something more equitably doesn't mean it is. And we can't, in a silo or in an echo chamber, determine that we're having that impact if we're not talking to the people. So anyone that has participated with our with our Planning Academy, they've been evaluated throughout the process and evaluated at the conclusion. And then those alums have often helped us as we continue to refine and hone the program moving forward, and also become part of the review process itself of future participants. So we feel that in many ways, while we have accomplished a lot that we are proud of, we're largely unsatisfied, because we realize that the work that needs to be done will probably take our entire life's work to create the dent that is necessary and is required of this city to meet its full potential. So I wanted to lift up some of those practical programs that are ongoing, as well as situational ones like the comp plan that give us a really great opportunity to take all of these community folks that we've provided more resources to, and have given them opportunities to take leadership as comp plan fellows, and encourage their neighbors and friends to also give voice into how we are co-producing and co-creating the initial drafts of the comp plan. So I know I've spoken for a while, but I'm really excited about this work. I honor, it's an honor to do this work, and it's an honor to work with my colleagues that particularly will speak after me about the ways we've been giving a lot of careful thought to how we can improve more equitable outcomes around the investments we make as a city in our capital budget. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Director. I think there are other presentations, Director Ryer, that we want to hear at this time, and then we'll capture all
Yes,
of
we
the
do.
questions.
Sarah Parnellum and Kristen Ahern. Sarah is overseeing the comp plan that Stephanie just mentioned, and Kristen's overseeing the capital budgeting process, which goes to the transgenerational equity and the larger infrastructure issues that you mentioned. I believe we have a PowerPoint for the capital budgeting piece, but if Sarah wants to say anything further about the comp plan, maybe we could start with that.
I think Stephanie gave a great overview of the comp plan, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions, but I did want to go ahead and share about an overview of the capital budget process, and talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing in terms of equity analysis and the opportunities that we see to push that analysis even further in the future. So I want to start, and please interrupt if I'm repeating things that the commission is already aware of, but I wanted to start with just kind of an overview of the capital budgeting process and kind of what the planning department's role is, and how the process works, and then we can talk a little bit about our equity analysis. So as you think about budget preparation, we're in a fairly unique situation in the city of Baltimore in terms of the Department of Planning's role in the budget preparation. In many cities, the Department of Finance really takes the lead role for the entire budget, but here, the Department of Finance does take the leadership role in terms of big picture financial planning. They set the tax rates, the debt levels, all of that kind of big picture financial planning. But then In terms of thinking about the operating budget and the capital budget, the Department of Finance, specifically BBMR, the Bureau of Budget and Management Research, takes the lead on the operating budget and preparing the operating budget, and the Department of Planning takes the lead on preparation of the capital budget. And this role makes sense for the Department of Planning because we are so involved with planning for neighborhoods, comprehensive planning, thinking about sustainability and historic preservation, all the things that the director mentioned. And so there's an opportunity for alignment between all of that planning that the department takes a lead role on and the capital budget, so that we can make sure that those things are reflected in the capital budget. So we're excited to have kind of this unique opportunity in the Department of Planning. Go to the next slide, please. I don't know if there's a way for me to, I don't think there's a way for me to control it from here. So just wanted to provide a little bit of orientation in terms of what the capital budget is. The Board of Estimates sets a policy that the capital budget is physical betterments and any of the studies kind of relevant to those. So there's a few things that are not part of the capital budget. It's not improvements that are less than $50,000. It's not included vehicular equipment, which can be more than $50,000 for our fire trucks or our trash trucks, but those are not included in the capital budget. It does not include repairs or maintenance that are less than $100,000 or that are emergency in nature. And it only includes salaries that are directly related to the projects. It doesn't include any other salaries. So here's some examples of some capital projects. It really runs the gamut in terms of lots of different physical improvements that you see around the city. Lots of our infrastructure, bridges and resurfacing of roads, bike lanes, sidewalks, our schools, our libraries, our municipal buildings, such as City Hall, where many of you are sitting today, our police stations, fire stations, senior centers, rec centers, like all of the municipal buildings of all different types, as well as our office buildings, such as the Benton Building, the Abel Woolman Building. It also includes our utilities, so our water and our wastewater, both the pipes and the plants, the pumping stations. And then we do include our community and economic development agencies. So we include things like demolition and housing redevelopment, support for our public markets. Those are all examples of different types of capital projects. Next. So by city charter, as I mentioned, the Planning Commission has a responsibility to prepare a 6-year capital improvement program. So we look into the future 6 years, and then the first year of the CIP becomes the basis for the capital component of the ordinance of estimates, and that's what's adopted by the City Council. So while we're preparing a 6-year program, that first year becomes part of the city's budget alongside the operating budget. And we begin the process again the following year, looking at the next set of 6 years. So this shows you some of the trends by fund source over the last decade or so, and you can see that the capital budget really varies from year to year. So while the operating budget is very consistent from year to year, the capital budget varies. And I'll show you on one of the future slides that the utilities, the water, the wastewater, and the stormwater really make up a very large percentage of the city's capital budget. And those vary a fair amount from year to year based on the planning cycle and the construction cycle of those large utility projects. And so that's really why you see this variation from year to year. Our local fund sources, such as general obligation bonds, don't vary that much, but those utilities vary quite a bit, as well as sometimes our state and federal funds can vary from year to year. So this shows you by fund source for fiscal 24, kind of what the breakdown is. And you can see that the utility revenue bonds and the county grants, this is the funds that the utilities get from the other counties that the utilities serve. So DPW serves Baltimore County for water service, make up more than half of the budget. And sometimes that can be as high as 3/4 of the budget. So the vast majority, when people look at the total amount and they say, oh, that's a lot of money for capital improvements, but a large portion of it is restricted. So those funds must be used for the utilities. That's what people pay on their water bills, and it has to be, those funds are restricted and have to be used for water, wastewater, and stormwater utility projects. And then you can see some of our less restricted fund sources are relatively small portions of the budget. So one of our very important fund sources are general obligation bonds, just under 10% for fiscal year 24. And then this is showing you by agency how the capital budget breaks down for fiscal year 24. So you can see, that the largest share is the utilities, close to $600 million for the utilities. And then you can see the total for each agency, as well as the amount that is general fund backed sources. And so those are the sources that we have more flexibility over, including our general obligation bonds, as well as our general funds. And so you can see, after the utilities, the Department of Transportation comes in at the next highest level. A lot of our local funding is leveraged with federal highway funds. And so many of the projects have an 80-20 match. And so, that's part of supporting those important projects from the Department of Transportation. Department of Recreation and Parks has an opportunity to get state funding each year, and so you'll see, that opportunity. Whereas for some of our agencies, like the Department of General Services, they're very much reliant only on the local funds. And so what we can do with those local funds really is what we have available to fix up our office buildings, to fix up our libraries, to fix up our police stations and our fire stations and all those types of facilities, our health centers. We are dependent on the local funding. So I think that Deputy Director Smith gave you kind of a great overview of the city's, of the department's equity work, and I wanted to talk specifically about the work that we've been doing in terms of equity as it relates to the CIP. So she mentioned that in 2015, the department launched an equity and planning committee, and then we brought in someone in 2018 to look at budgets and to basically start to think about how can we analyze our budgets and how can we increase outreach. So we wanted to look at both kind of the distributional side as well as the procedural side in terms of thinking about equity related to the capital budget. And then the following year, we partnered with Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance to take that analysis further and worked with them to publish our first formal equity analysis, looking back all the way back to FY14. We have been updating that analysis using the methodology described in that first report on an annual basis, as Director Ryer mentioned. And then included in that report were recommendations about how to take this work to the next level. And so we have been implementing some of those recommendations. So in the summer of 2020, we launched our CIP Oversight Committee. We had some new requirements for project proposals, and we've continued to kind of make those adjustments each year. So we revisited our evaluation criteria. We've been working on some policies. And then in 2023, we went through an equity audit, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So this is the process that we go through for formulating recommendations. It really is kind of a year-long process to get us to the recommendations for the following year. So we start the process early in the fall by providing agencies with likely funding levels and their instructions. And then the agencies submit their projects for consideration around Thanksgiving. And then we work with them over the winter to revise and publish those requests and begin the review process. So all of the agencies present to the Planning Commission in January. Those are opportunities for the public to hear, as well as the Planning Commission, to hear firsthand from the agencies about what their priorities are, what they've achieved with prior year's allocations, what their needs are that maybe can't be met with the available funding, and to ask questions and to talk about various priorities that people want to put forward. We make recommendations and have a work session with the Planning Commission, and then in March, the Planning Commission votes, and that's the first formal step in terms of approval of the capital improvement program. Following the Planning Commission vote, the capital improvement program goes through a series of approvals. The next step is the Board of Finance approval, and then the Board of Estimates, that's coming up. I think the date is May 10th. And then the first year, I mentioned this is a 6-year program. The first year is then adopted by the City Council in June and becomes part of the city's budget alongside the operating budget. We've put in place evaluation criteria and to really look systematically at all of the projects that agencies request. And so the first criteria is whether the project is required by a state or federal law. We want to make sure we understand that right up front. And then we want to look at a series of additional factors. And so you can see equity is kind of right up front. Does this project help close a gap in outcomes? Is it addressing the equity legislation in terms of closing gaps in outcomes based on race, based on income, et cetera? We look at health and safety, asset condition, and I think that this really is some of these are hard to separate out. And so, the asset condition is sometimes very much tied into equity, tied into health and safety, but we've tried to ask these as discrete questions in terms of thinking about the condition of the building or the condition of the infrastructure, the return on investment, the environmental impact, and then efficiency and effectiveness. We had some focus groups with residents as we were coming up with these evaluation criteria, and that was one of the ones that we hadn't necessarily thought of that emerged from those focus groups, is to be asking those types of questions as we evaluate requests from agencies. So we know that the needs of our agencies far exceed the available budget. The potential projects, the list of potential projects that agencies could submit for funding is probably close to infinite, right? As somebody who, as you experience the city, you can see streets that are in disrepair, you can see buildings that are in disrepair, you can see opportunities to do modern and new things. And so that list is quite large, but we limit what agencies can submit. We provide them limits in terms of what they can submit for consideration. And that is where we're applying our evaluation criteria to what they submitted, not to necessarily the whole universe of what they could have submitted, but really we're applying that evaluation criteria to the list of things that an agency submitted in order to come up with recommendations regarding what gets funded. So here's some examples. I think Director Breyer passed out one of our reports. If you flip through it, you'll see maps like this. We were able to allocate the funds that are recommended through the capital budget based on geography for as many projects as we possibly could. And we identified kind of what the area of influence of each project was. So does it influence kind of on a neighborhood level? Does it influence kind of at a bigger a regional level, or does it influence citywide? And we've mapped those dollars. So you can see kind of looking at all of the projects that are excluding DPW. You can see one map, and then you can look at the other map that focuses specifically on DPW. Because we did that because the level of funding for DPW is really at a very different scale from all of the other agencies. And it's also a very different type of project. So some of the other projects are kind of felt by residents in a different type of way than the infrastructure that DPW is responsible for. So we use this to look at kind of where funding is falling and to ask agencies questions about the distribution of their requests. In addition to looking at it geographically, because unfortunately Baltimore is very segregated racially, we are able to use our geographic analysis to also look at the allocations in terms of race. So we look at the different community statistical areas, and we're able to see which are the areas that have different different percentages in terms of race, and we're able to see what the allocations are based on those. So this is looking at if the allocations were even in those different quartiles, you would have these bars match up with the lines, but you can see that they're not, right? So in some areas we have higher allocations, and in other areas we have lower allocations. And we're looking at this not just for race. I think on the next slide you can see the analysis for income as well. Look at the next one. Yeah, for household income. So we're looking at the quartiles for the community statistical areas based on income. So the quarter of community statistical areas that have the lowest income, the quarter of community statistical areas that have the next highest income, the next highest income, and then the highest income, and seeing kind of what the distribution of capital investments is in those different types of neighborhoods. Then I've mentioned a couple times that this is kind of an ongoing process, right? So we have, I think, done a lot of work in terms of our equity analysis, but we know that there is a lot more to do. And so these are some opportunities that were identified through the equity audit that we recently went through of the CIP. So one consideration is to explore giving a weight to the equity criteria in our project prioritization process. Another was to monitor equity-related data on spend. We're really focusing on the front end of this process and the budget allocations, but there was a recommendation to look at also where agencies are spending the money, particularly in those cases where we don't have the location information at the beginning of the process. There's a recommendation and an opportunity to improve resident participation in the capital budgeting process, as well as the implementation of projects, which again is kind of beyond our direct role, but is something that we're very much interested in. And then we're looking forward to coordinating with the Office of Equity and Civil Rights on a citywide equity plan. We think that will be key guidance, not just for the capital budget, but for many of the other things that the planning department works on as well. And then I think this is the last slide. This is something that we have really been wrestling with in terms of the state of good repair of the city's assets. So I mentioned, I think a couple times, that the resources that agencies need in order to invest in our infrastructure far exceeds what we have available. And so this chart tries to put numbers to that. So looking at how much, for example, the Department of General Services needs to achieve a state of good repair, and comparing that to how much is allocated to that agency. Well, this chart doesn't compare that to the annual allocation, but sort of how much they would need on an annual basis. So we can look at this and say on an annual basis, DGS would need $58 million. I can tell you that they typically get about 15 million at best. And so you can see that we have kind of this ongoing structural deficit in terms of what we're investing in our infrastructure. I will close there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Director Wright, are there any other presentations that No. We need to hear from staff. All right. Thank you to all of you who have contributed a lot of information. And certainly, we're not going to exhaust the conversation on this evening, so I want to make sure that we kind of prioritize where there are some of the questions. I think, Director Ryer, you wanted to speak a bit to some of the equity issues in terms of infrastructure. I wanted to kind of think
Yes.
about that I want to hear from you about that, and then we'll get into the questions.
Okay, so as Sarah just pointed out, 2/3 of the capital budget is in water, wastewater, and stormwater. Why is that? They have a dedicated funding source, right? They're not funded out of the general fund or out of borrowing. They are funded out of borrowing, but they are backed up by the utility bills that citizens get. So what's the equity issue there? So what I would argue is that for probably 2 generations, this city underestimated and underinvested in its water infrastructure. And our citizens today, which are a smaller population, a poorer population, are paying for that. They are paying for the fact that previous citizens did not pay for that. We are doing that now in the rest of the capital budget. So in the Department of Transportation, for example, our capital budget is almost nothing, and future citizens will pay for that. They will either pay that in deteriorated infrastructure, or they will pay for that in higher costs to maintain and repair the infrastructure. So there is a major overall equity issue with the capital budget that spans generations. And when we defer maintenance, as we are doing all over the place, a future generation will pay for that defer. Just like our widows all over Baltimore are paying exorbitant water bills, that will happen in other ways in the future, the way we are. So what I think Sarah referred to it, there's plenty of data and documentation by all the agents of their need to maintain the infrastructure. We know what it costs. It's roughly $2 billion of deferred maintenance. But the only money we put into the capital budget is what we don't put into the operating budget. The operating budget is serving today's citizens. The capital budget is serving tomorrow's citizens. So when the tomorrow's citizens get the leftovers from today's citizens, you end up in a situation like we are with the water bills today. And so that's, I think Stephanie, the fourth definition of equity was transgenerational equity. That's a rare, it's a fairly rare example of transgenerational equity.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll open it up to commissioners for any questions you have. Commissioner Finnegan-Carr.
So thank you again to all of you for your presentations. This was definitely very thorough
Awesome
and
team.
insightful. And we appreciate all that you've been able to provide for us. It was good to hear about the our Baltimore, the Plan Our Baltimore, the actual comprehensive planning that was mentioned by Director Smith and Ahern, and looking forward to seeing what comes of that, especially knowing that the plans have been, hampered for so many reasons, COVID included, in getting those out. So I'm looking forward to that. One of the questions I have is related to procedural equity, which was mentioned as one of the things that the Equity and Planning Commission is working towards addressing.
Yeah.
Knowing that you spoke in the beginning about some of the things that you all have addressed, the 21st century school revitalization, the Inspire program, the Green Network plan, Also thinking in terms of the fact that we have numerous buildings that need to either go up for sale or, different land use issues. I know, for example, Venable School was on the city council budget or the city council
For sale.
list this week for
Yep.
sale. And there are several other buildings that might be the issue of, just knowing that we've been prolonging some of them because of COVID. And some of it, the city council people, different people in the community are aware of, and some of it we're not aware of. It's just they've been sitting there for a while, and people are like, I'm wondering what's happening. I'm wondering what are the procedures? Like, thinking of procedural equity, how are we making sure that the community is being included in these decisions of what is happening within neighborhoods for some of these long-standing issues, because we're waiting for this planning, but there's still other things that need to happen in the meanwhile. Like, what are the procedures that we're doing?
Okay, I'll try. I was going to start with talking about this commission and our commissions. This commission meets at 6 p.m. Our commissions meet at 1 p.m. We have invested heavily in a type of hybrid technology that will allow our legal work to occur both hybrid and in person. We've done a parking survey. You may or may not know that after 6 p.m., parking's free north of Baltimore Street. So there's a procedural part there that we're kind of in the middle of. And I think you're asking about procedural equity with our community planning process. So to start with, I mentioned earlier, having this core of trained planners out in the neighborhoods that can understand who is included and who's not included is kind of our ears and eyes on the ground. I think a second piece that's maybe more pretty recent is that we've created guidelines for two different types of plan, a city-driven plan and a community-driven plan. So communities have the ability to do their own planning process. We like to participate and advise that to show, but they can take their own plan to the Planning Commission for adoption. The community-based plan does not incur a city financial obligation. In other words, that's the difference. In essence, if the community comes in and says, we want you to rebuild Pratt Street, it doesn't mean the city's committing to rebuilding Pratt Street. In an ideal world, a city-backed plan would inform the capital budgeting process. When there's an extreme shortage of capital like there is now, that we struggle tremendously with that when you have $1 and you need 10. So even that's not that effective. But we have created this process, this doorway for communities to come in and present to the commission and be accepted by the commission. Our standards are built around inclusiveness, not content. They're built around process. I think that's maybe one of the more recent examples we can give of the community planning process being informed by our equity agenda.
Mr. Chair, can I add to the commissioner's question?
Certainly.
Sorry, I can't see what's going on in there, so I apologize for speaking up. But to the commissioner's question, and just to add on to the director's description of our neighborhood planning policy, I want to visit what happened prior to a policy like that to speak to why procedural equity is so important. You can live in a community where maybe you have several faith houses, right? And they might want to embark on a community planning effort. But the great majority of the parishioners maybe live elsewhere, do not live in that community. Perhaps you're a major employer that wants to devise a community set of priorities. we as an agency felt that to call a singular stakeholder-driven initiative a neighborhood or community plan that was not really conceived or in any way reflecting the will of the people that actually reside in the community was problematic. And so the neighborhood planning policy requires every stakeholder to be notified, for there to be an actual example that meetings not only were announced, that people attended them, and to ensure that one community group cannot unilaterally speak and give voice to an entire community's self-determination. And so I just want to make sure, for the benefit of the commissioners, that the neighborhood planning policy is a really important part of equity, because many times those who have access to resources were articulating a vision for places that they did not even live, simply because they either owned property or had other type of institutional footholds, but were leaving out the actual people who lived there. And we did not want that to continue. And now moving forward, in order to have a neighborhood plan accepted by Planning Commission, you will have to have shown that you met all the benchmarks and the guidance appropriate to show that everyone affected was a part of this, and that I couldn't just, me and you, decide we're going to plan for a patch of the city we do not live in.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up? Assistant Director Smith, on that point, when we look at the neighborhood plans that are on the planning department's site, some of them say adopted, some of them say accepted, some of them are relatively recent, some not so much. So based on what you just described, where do those existing neighborhood master plans fit within the procedural equity that you're talking about? Are they current? Do they need to go through some updating and revising? Are they no longer valid, so to speak? Or has the department changed its posture in terms of whether or not it continues to support the plan in existing form or something else?
So yes, so the reference to, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Chair, the word accepted shows that those were policies that came after the adoption of the neighborhood planning policy that I believe, forgive me, I believe it might have been 2018 or so that happened, just to give you a sense. And so you're right, there are standing plans on the books that preceded that maybe have not seen the same level of traction that those who initially conceived them would want. And I think that was part of the neighborhood planning policy too, is that we felt like we need to manage expectations, right? If a community member has successfully, with a few folks, established a plan, but there's not ongoing will of a community group or some other longstanding stakeholder to continue to prioritize advocacy around the implementation of that plan, it will not be as successful as a plan that not only shows broad support among relevant stakeholders, but also has maybe very realistic, measurable guideposts for what can be achieved in a certain amount of time. And so we felt that the neighborhood planning policy, in concert with the Planning Academy, has yielded neighborhood plans that I think not only have the ability to be implemented after acceptance in a very meaningful and more realistic way, but it's also equipped those community stakeholders to be those community level accountability shepherds of that advocacy that I don't believe was always existing in prior efforts, no matter how well-intentioned they were at that time. So I know, for example, there are some major master plans that still have the infrastructure to continue to prioritize the work, for example, in Park Heights, right? Some of the delays around the implementation related to the Park Heights master plan were related to the economic downturn in the aughts. Is that what they're calling it? The late 2009, to 2011. So some of the fits and starts we saw there were more borne by the market, as less so than a desire and focus of the city and stakeholders, whereas some maybe just did not have that ongoing empowered shepherd at the community level to continue to use the plan itself as a tool of advocacy for its interactions with the city. And so that is what we're hoping through the master plan process. We'll be able to say, this is the macro, this is the big vision for the city. And then to the degree your community is interested in pursuing a neighborhood plan, this is how it dovetails with that broader vision. So I don't think we want to throw out those old plans, but we need to reimagine with those relevant stakeholders of today, what happened with those plans that you felt were great, what didn't happen that should have happened, and then kind of, I think, update according to the interests of the present day stakeholders.
Okay, I'll have follow-up questions after the hearing that we can kind of flesh that out a bit, because I think the procedural equity question around the viability of pre-existing neighborhood plans is probably a big foundational piece that has to be really kind of solidified so that we don't kind of handicap our efforts by dismissing a process, whether or not we agreed with it. There's some level of expectations that we have to figure out. Are they still current? Do we need to engage them? Where's the Mayor's Office of Neighborhoods and maybe helping to facilitate that process with some of these stakeholders? I think those are the kinds of things that I would want to kind of see if we can put our heads around as we're getting ready to send our report to the mayor and the council. Commissioner Evangelista.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? Yes, Director, I have a question for you, please. Could you speak to specifically how do you square the equity gap when it comes to the selection process of allocations of resources to communities? How do you make that determination? I see your fiscal year 2023 DPW allocation per capita. And I'm just curious, how is that, what is your process or procedure to select these particular communities to receive these particular allocations?
It's a hard thing to do. So I think Sarah outlined the, I forget the exact 8 or 9 criteria that we put a capital project through. So we're trying to reduce the requested amount, which again has no relation to the need. It's the amount they're allowed to request, down to the amount that we can afford. And so we use those 8 criteria to do that. Some of them are simplistic. They're legally required or the bridge is falling down. But we've placed more emphasis on the equity piece in recent years based on that analysis that we showed you. So where that would come into play, for example, pick a neighborhood service, a library or a rec center. It would be very useful in those situations. It's not very useful if you don't have a lot of money. Right now, we have recovery funds and a jolt influx, and I think the capital budget will reflect that. So I don't want to lose the main point that we're underinvesting in general.
Sure.
But I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we've got a handle on how to look at this from an equity standpoint, map it. There's some exclusions to that. For example, public works, it's about 40% of the budget, and it's hard to map the water system. So the first year we did it, for example, there's a huge project burying tanks in Druid Hill Park, and all of a sudden, that neighborhood looked like the richest neighborhood in the city, but it had no impact on the citizens. In fact, it was a pain in the rear for them. Part of our ongoing negotiations with DPW in that situation is how to geocode and classify those kinds of projects to make it more accurate and more useful.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Assistant Director Smith, I have a quick question for you.
There she is.
Okay. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, how you doing? First, I
good,
would
how are
say,
you?
I do appreciate the master plan as well as the planning academy that you suggested that you're implementing. I do have a question. You did mention some of the goals were dialogue, recruitment, retention, policy, capital investment, internal practices, correct? There were some of the goals that you suggested. One of the things that you did mention that really struck a chord in terms of like, wow, this is great. You mentioned young people. And I'm just curious, as part of the master plan, particularly with the Planning Academy, do you have young people that you are actually working with within the communities, particularly within the community associations and things of that nature that are part of this planning for the master plan, if you will?
Yes, thank you for that question. So one of the things we started when we launched outreach around the Plan Our Baltimore comp planning process is we put out an application opportunity for folks to serve as ambassadors. And we wanted to emphasize, we wanted community leaders who wanted to ensure that their community members' perspectives were included. And one of the partnering groups that participated as an ambassador was No Boundaries, which you may be familiar with in West Baltimore. And so they actually were our partner on a series of focus groups that were focused on what young people wanted to see in the future of their city. I know one of the things we were thinking about, and it was a little different because COVID had impacted the way we interacted with schools just a little bit, compared to the last time we did the update in 2006. We wanted to do some similar outreach, and we still are planning to do so to get some reaction from young people, because as I mentioned earlier, it was the young people last time that we did the comp plan that really had some of the most relevant public transit perspective. And as you know, there's been a series of stories and research coming out about how the inability to traverse the city is actually impacting which schools someone even goes to upon even receiving admission if they cannot reliably get there to be successful. So we did intentionally ensure that we had partners that could help us reach out. And then we also partnered with community leaders that had ties to those communities where English was not the first language, to ensure that we were partnering with faith houses and other youth institutions that had more of a foothold with particularly Spanish-speaking young people and families. So I do want to lift up that language is as important as well.
Very good, thank you. One last question, and I'm done. Director, just one last question. As part of the goals, you, Assistant Smith, mentioned recruitment and retention. What is your plan for 3 to 5 years to maintain a diverse department that you have right now? Staff.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a very good question. So I must admit, we've been focused on recruitment, not retention. I think we have a little bit of time there. My short answer would be that I think we're all working on the management side to make it a good place to work. For example, I'll give an example I'm very proud of. I meet regularly with the planning director for the city of Philadelphia. Our package of salary and benefits is much better than their package of salary and benefits, and our recruitment is much easier than her recruitment. And she's quite jealous of our ability to do that. So I feel like we're fundamentally solid. I will also say that city planners are not county planners. They don't want to work in the county. And on top of that, I will say in grad school, I had a professor that had done a study of job satisfaction and found that local planners had a higher level of job satisfaction than state planners who had a higher level of job satisfaction than than federal planners. I started out as a community planner. I thought I'd struck gold with that. The only other job I've had is director of a community development corporation in Baltimore, which is the only thing more local than a community planner can be. So I do feel we have a very positive workforce environment.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I do appreciate the partnership that you have with Morgan State University.
Yeah.
I'm a graduate. I did my doctoral work there, so I do appreciate that relationship.
I would like to speak to that for a second. Actually, that was one of our initiatives. I in fact, went through graduate school on a HUD fellowship that was administered by Morgan. And one of the recommendations, we had a mayoral fellow look at our hiring practices, our staff, and our internship programs. And we became very conscious of we are a popular place to intern. We get calls all the time. But we don't have a budget for interns. So therein lies the equity issue. So I approached Morgan over a year ago to partner where if we could provide, for example, a full-time internship, daytime internship, would the university provide the tuition? So the problem is, in this budget, last cycle or two, we have not been able to obtain the funding to pay interns. We have a plan matched out. We submit it as an enhancement in our budget process. And we thought we had it funded this year, but at the last minute, you may have heard the budget problems the city had, that enhancement got cut. So that's an outstanding piece that we're still wrestling with. And I can't help but feel that we're not the only agency in the city with this problem.
Okay. Commissioner Finnegan-Carr.
Yes. And I'm not sure if this question is best for you or for Assistant Director Smith, but specifically the third goal of the Equity and Planning Committee is using the equity lens to develop, revise, and evaluate city policies. And I was wondering if one of you could speak a little bit. We've talked about the capital investments and some of the other things, but I really would like some input into what specifically the city policies overall that you all are helping to develop, revise, and evaluate, because as we have been speaking with multiple city agencies, a lot of the policies, when we ask them about, they go, we have no control over, that's planning. So
You're going to get us in trouble here. Right. There have been efforts to make us the sort of equity coordinator for the city. I think as a department, we're very uncomfortable with that role. For example, I'll give you a perfect example with the Planning Academy. Probably every department head would send staff to the Planning Academy if we would let them, but we don't let them because we are targeting people that have been left out of the process in the communities for that resource. So I don't know if Stephanie has anything else to contribute, but the short answer to your question is our role here is through the capital budgeting process. That's why we emphasize it so much. That's where we have some actual control and power. And we work closely with Director Moore, and those conversations have been around a joint equity plan for the city that includes the capital budget. So that will start to get at that relationship between the capital budget and the operating budget, I hope. And so we're exploring, there is no city contribution to date, but we're exploring private sources of funding for that with the Office of Civil Rights and Equity. I don't know if Stephanie has anything else to add.
You're on mute.
I apologize. I'm happy to offer a couple more points if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I wanted to say that while there is an actual prong focus on CIP as obviously the premier city policy that we are focused on because we at least have more control of our contributions there than overall, I just wanted to highlight that there are some things that we've done that we've been able to export to some of our sister agencies successfully that didn't necessitate a law change. Like, for example, many of you who are familiar with federal regulations, if you want to provide public comment on regulations.gov, when you provide that public comment, it's a record that is available for anyone to peruse or see. But in many instances, the public commenting methods for various agencies have often been not uniform and not necessarily publicly transparent. It may be input that was going into a portal or to an email, but no one else could see what was being received. And so we started using very intentionally, we researched and decided upon a platform now known as Conveo that allows members of the public to provide comment within the actual PDF directly, but I think most importantly, provide an opportunity for the public to respond to the comments of others in the document, to make those comments come alive and ultimately more valuable, not only to us as the inside, stakeholders who are evaluating the comment, but I can tell you in a prior life where I did provide a lot of federal public comment, if I saw that Commissioner Yeary had already taken care of something, well, then I don't need to say it. But if you went through the record and you saw nobody's, lifted up something, then you realize, oh, I need to say something. Mm-hmm. So providing more sunlight into the public commenting process, not just for our agency, but for other agencies, I think is something that really using our soft power, not in a real formal, beat someone over the head thing, people go, oh, wow, that seems useful. And so we've been sharing our access to that platform with our sister agencies. And I think it will continue to, become more normalized as people see the value.
If I could add one more thing to tie it back to the earlier question about community planning. We do, as I mentioned earlier, we do work very closely with the Department of Housing and Community Development. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why we're not focused on community plans right now is that they have something they call the Framework for Community Development, which identifies a dozen or so highly distressed neighborhoods where we have land or investments or what have you near a market, and we are prioritizing our community development work. So in that instance, the community planners are on the ground in those neighborhoods working on a block-to-block basis with the resources of the housing department. So it's not, the planning is very directly tied to implementation. And then the city as a general has stood up something called the neighborhood subcabinet, which is the way our community development work gets the other agencies to participate. So the mayor and the CAO chair the neighborhood subcabinet. Agencies like transportation or rec and park are required to be there. And when there is an issue that involves that agency in that neighborhood, it's addressed there. So I think the good news is that this type of community planning work is much more closely tied to implementation than the traditional community planning work, which is, here's a plan, let's hope we can pull it off. There's every 3 months, there's a meeting at the neighborhood subcabinet about the Park Heights community. Every agency is there, the community's there. And the planning and HCD team are presenting what we've done since the last meeting and what we're going to be doing in the future.
Okay.
Director, you may not want to go too far. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions just thematically, and we're going to close right on time, and then we'll have some follow-up after tonight. A couple of things. As I was listening to the capital improvement presentation and looking at the mapping and the color coding, DPW versus no DPW, and then the assessment that was done by Benya. When we look at the kind of the neighborhood rankings in Benya, it kind of gives us different flows, right? Criminal justice, education, median income, housing numbers, all of those things. Are we analyzing the data with the expenditures to figure out if the goals are being met, or are there no goals? When we look at this assessment that starts with key takeaways, the executive summary from that report, we still have allocation issues, distribution issues that were pointed out in that study, for which I've not heard that this is how we know we're going to address that, and here are going to be the benchmarks that are going to help us know we're on track. So if we're going to set a 10-year forward-looking plan, kind of aspirational, right? This is what we believe can be done, assuming that certain things are going to be met. Funding's always going to be kind of tricky. How do we know that the planning goal and the planning objective, other than the fact we get something done, actually helps to address the structural inequities in the city? My concern is with these new dollars coming, are we potentially looking at an issue that for projects that are near completion may need a little more funding, maybe a different priority? They're going to get the priority that they have enjoyed. Communities that gap has gotten wider, and we've got more ground to make up, and therefore it's going to take more investment to be able to close those gaps. Well, because the gap is so big, and we don't know what our resource capacity is going to look like, we can't really deal with that. The concern is really one of, are we really being pragmatic in addressing the closing of these gaps? Or is there a need for a plan to close those gaps so that when I hear you say we got the 12 most distressed communities, that's kind of the housing department's analysis, are those the same 12 that you all would identify as distressed? And what do we mean by distressed? What's the distress? I think when we start using these terms, and the frustration, as you know, being a community planner, is that we often use terms in policy that have no relevance to the reality on the ground.
It's a big question. I'll start at the end and work my way backward. So first of all, we know those 12 distressed communities are only part of a much larger subset. That's the cruel irony of it. The premise of the neighborhood subcabinet is that we might be able to do something about those 12, and we might not on others. There's a different, I mentioned the Green Network Plan. That is a way of adapting to vacancy. Right, when you have vacant property, vacant houses, you're not building a new house. You are demolishing a house and planting a garden or something. You are adjusting that. Maybe 10 years from now, that's going to be different, but for now. But to your larger question, I've been through 4 capital budgets now, and I've had the honor of taking this mayor and his administration through the last 2 of them. And unfortunately, I would argue that our capital resources are so stretched that your question is almost academic. It may not be as academic in the near future because of the recovery funds and the unknown infrastructure bill, which we really haven't focused on because everybody's focused on the recovery funds right now. And maybe if there's a little more leeway there, there's a little attempt to do things you want to do rather than you have to do. that would be an important question. But when I see our team go through this and the last two times, I mean, we go through the spreadsheet of hundreds of projects line by line with the CAO, the deputy mayor, and the mayor. And only in less than half a dozen cases do they have a other idea and it's usually, oh, we have another way to fund that, because whenever you want to fund something, you cut something. So we can cut this and pay for what I want to pay for because we have another way to pay for that. It's really that the minutia is there at every dollar. When you essentially what you saw today is that the city's capital budget these days is about $100 million, and the deferred maintenance is about $2 billion. So that's the reality, and the process is really, it's so, you only fund what you absolutely have to do. That's what I've learned in this job, and it's a horrible truth, but that's the way we are. Exception is the water and utilities, and that's why I bring up the transgenerational equity issue, because we are creating this problem for future citizens with the rest of the capital budget down the road. I mean, eyes wide open on that. I don't know if the citizens or anybody else, but the planning department knows that. But I do feel that that the budget is so thin that question, we never get to it because bridges are falling down.
Right, and highways to nowhere have disrupted
Yeah.
the continuity of neighborhoods with no clearly achieved objective.
Right. Have you read the book? There's a new book out on the interstate system in general, including the highway. That's written by an alumni of the planning department. Just came out this year.
I will look forward to reading it. Here's what troubles me. That's almost a fatalistic reality. There's a part of Baltimore that has become accustomed to being kind of left behind. And because we don't have enough resource and the prioritization is what it is, that may just be the way things are until we get more resource to work with, if we're stretched that thin, to which I would then raise the question, how are we engaging our federal partners in terms of identifying funding opportunities with that as a driver, since I would think that we would have a pretty favorable relationship with the current administration to try to move these metrics sooner rather than
Right, good question. First of all, I want to say I am not a pessimist. The fact that we have assembled 60 acres in Park Heights is it's phenomenal, what we're doing in Park Heights and in Oliver and Johnson Square. We're doing phenomenal things. To your question about the federal infrastructure bill, it is a little bit of an open issue right now. Historically, the Mayor's Office of Government Relations has managed that relationship. They often hire lobbyist firms to do that. I know on the federal side, there's a firm in place that's been there for 20 years or so. It's that picture is changing. Agencies are trying to stake out their turf to look at their priorities. We, for example, Highway to Nowhere, planning with our community outreach, partnered with transportation. They know the federal transportation regulations. So we've already received one grant towards that. There'll be at least another before we actually do something. The director of MOGR, Mayor's Office of Government Relations, is vacant right now. And I think they were just trying to get through the General Assembly. But I would expect that position to be filled, and then we'll have another conversation about government relations, the new Office of Infrastructure Development, which is right now focused on getting projects out the door. Like, that's been our priority, is spending what we already have, doing it on time, in a timely way, in a cost-effective way. But we haven't yet pivoted to what else is out there and who's doing what and all that. I will say, in our world, we take responsibility for the sustainability package. So we already have staff aggressively looking at opportunities there. We've also stood up a sustainability subcabinet to support that work in other agencies. But I wouldn't say there's a centralized approach yet, but I would invite you to ask that question again in 6 months, and I think it'll be a very different answer.
Don't worry. I'm looking forward to asking the question as many times as
Good.
warranted. You mentioned staffing. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about what the diversity numbers look like in planning. What are the objectives?
No, I'd have to look and get back to you on that.
So that we will do that by way of follow-up. We just want to make sure that we at least honor that analysis as well. So much of this is focused on what's going on in addressing kind of the real structural deficits that have been in the city for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
We understand we didn't just get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this place overnight.
I'm sorry, I wanted to interrupt. And I again, I'm not a pessimist. The Finance Department is well aware of this issue, and they would, I think that's a big accomplishment, they would recognize that the capital budget is grossly underfunded. Their quandary is how to cut the operating budget. They don't want to do that. We want to grow the pot, not divvy it up better. I think that's where and there are schemes, conversations about how to do that.
There's a number of conversations going on about population loss, who's contributing to the tax base, what does that look like in the city.
Mm-hmm.
We've got access to capital issues that are historical.
Mm-hmm.
Some
Yeah.
neighborhoods you just can't get the dollars to go in because whether it's on the back of the napkin or full pro forma, it's hard to get it to work without having some resource to close the gap.
Mm-hmm. That's my background, actually, in that kind of work.
Well, you're in a good spot then.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
we have
work.
launched. You'll see some reporting on it. It's a pilot project with recovery funds called our Middle Neighborhood Strategy, and it's targeted. Our population loss is in sort of black, working class, middle class neighborhoods, and immigrants. Most of the immigrant drop-off has been because of the federal policies. So the Middle Neighborhood pilot is targeting these areas where we have population loss, and I could give you like an overview of that strategy at some point.
That would be helpful just from raising the awareness of the commission.
Uh-huh.
When we know the narrative, we know the story,
Right.
we know
Right.
we don't know the approaches, the opportunities, the challenges, where we need to collaborate to figure this out, to make progress. Mm-hmm. And that's really, I think, the important part of this hearing is to really kind of get a sense of where we are. I recall our beloved late Congressman Elijah Cummings having a meeting at his office trying to get a sense of what was the state of play in terms of progress with the master plans. And at that time, we couldn't get a really clear answer because of the issues, right? If you have issues of resource uncertainty, mm-hmm. what you may put out as your comprehensive plan year one, every year you may have to tweak it a little bit because there may be variations. The economy's shifting. We don't know what tax revenue may or may not look like going down the road, or what other expenses may prioritize
Right.
Something else.
Right.
It's important when I look at the racial composition of the neighborhoods that are disaffected in this process. Mm-hmm. It raises, I think, some concerns, at least as the chair and amongst my colleagues, that this depletion of human resource, people, that makes the city is the greatest harm from our inability to fund places, healthy places for them to be. When we look at these numbers, and this is a whole discussion, we're not going to resolve it tonight, but I do think the work that you're doing is important. I want to explore how we can help support reaching out to get some of the resources. If it is young talent, interns to be able to get there, then that should be maybe a collaboration around our philanthropic partners to see how do we get you some support to be able to get the information needed to be able to make a robust plan that we can get some collaborative buy-in, right? Not everybody's going to be able to be first, but we got to make the progress. You all are trying hard, but it's a big thing to wrap your arm around, and we appreciate the work that you're doing.
So perhaps at a future meeting, we could come back specifically, take an hour to talk about the middle neighborhood strategy, because it would be very timely. We have this pot of money. It's a partnership of 2 agencies and 2 nonprofits with a total of about $9 million. It turns into a pumpkin in 3 years, so we have to spend it, and each organization has their role in this, and we're targeting essentially 5 new areas that we haven't worked in the past, and it's around wealth building, household wealth building.
If there is a way that members of the commission can support that, not to create another thing to do, but just in the course of you all having your convenings and your discussions, kind of understand a bit about what's going on. Certainly, we are open to and looking forward to supporting you in that regard as well. Okay. Sometimes just getting into a room where it's not a meeting, an official meeting, where it's a working session, right? Let's get to some understanding. Let's get an idea board going, and let's make sure that we find a place where we can connect so that we're part of the solution. So we're looking forward to that. Any final thoughts? As it's 8:02, I want to honor the time. I'm a little past, so you get the final word before I give some final instructions.
No, Stephanie, Sarah, Kristen, any final word? Well, thank you very much for having us. This was a great discussion.
Glad to see you. I see Director Moore has shown up on the screen. I want to acknowledge you and certainly give you an opportunity to offer any thoughts that you might have this evening. Good evening, Director.
Good evening, and I know that the day has been long and the time is short. I don't want to prolong the day. Just a few things. First, I want to start with thanks to the Office of Equity and Civil Rights and our Community Relations Commission team that made this hearing possible. They work hard. There's a lot that happens before everybody gets into the room, and they do that very well and exceptionally well. So I just want to say thank you to the team. Thank you to the commission for having the hearing and for showing the interest in the city agencies and giving an opportunity to not just uplift the work of the commission, but to focus on the work of the Department of Planning. And I just want to add there that we are working together. We're charged to work together to develop an equity plan for the city. And just a little bit of progress to share on that. Just today, I had a meeting with a group called the City Data Alliance, which is really sponsored by the Bloomberg Philanthropies. They are helping my office develop a RFI, a request for information, that will be we'll be able to get that out on the street. There is no financial commitment that must be made first, but the RFI will really focus on asking interested persons lots of questions that really need to be answered as we begin the effort to develop an equity plan and an equity study. One of the things that they suggested is that we do what I call a plan scan, really an inventory of agency equity plans that already exist. We know that Department of Planning has one. Recreation and Parks is developing one, and other agencies are a little bit down the road developing those. But we need to know what's already happening, and that will inform us in terms of creating an equity plan for the entire city. Funding, that is, if there's one theme thread that runs through this hearing, it is the challenges that we all grapple with regard to funding. My office grapples with that. Every agency does. And we know that it's going to get a little bit tighter going ahead because we have very real commitments to the city school system. So in that regard, the City Data Alliance has agreed to help us identify funding for the equity plan, which could estimates could be as high as $500,000 to do a really good, thorough, comprehensive plan for the city of Baltimore. We expect that the office will get a little bit of funding through the upcoming fiscal year budget process, but more is needed. And it's wonderful to have a partner like the City Data Alliance to help us identify that and to be walking with the Department of Planning in this effort. So more to come on that. A good conversation for us to have. We do enjoy a good partnership with the Department of Planning, and really I have been here listening, not on camera, off camera, I'm at home, but listening to all the good questions, and Commissioner Finnegan Carr got us started really well with some hard questions. And of course, you're coming in and finishing us off. So really just thank you for a good evening. And we look forward to more conversations specifically on planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Moore. Very quickly, I want to acknowledge my colleagues. Commissioner Finnegan Carr, any closing thoughts before we get ready to adjourn?
Just thank you very much to the Department of Planning for all of your remarks tonight.
Commissioner Evangelista.
Thank you.
I echo my colleagues. Thank you for a great introduction to some heavy lifting that you all do and the work that you do. Certainly, I echo Director Moore's appreciation for members of the OECR staff who keep us on track and making sure that things go well. Chief Kelly keeps us on task, and so that's always good to know. For the record, the public record for tonight's hearing will remain open for 7 days. Next Wednesday, close of business. If there are any questions or comments that any members of the public would like to add to the record, we are happy to receive them. And Chief Kelly, remind me where they go to offer them.
Lisa.Kelly@baltimorecity.gov.
Lisa.Kelly, Kelly, @baltimorecity.gov. That's Chief Kelly's email address. To members of the commission, if you have any follow-up questions, we would also want to get them to Chief Kelly so that she might get them to Director Ryer. And then whatever the reasonable time is that Director Ryer and his team need to be able to get those answers back to us, we are certainly amenable to those. The input and the feedback from tonight's hearing will be a part of the commission's anticipated report that will go to the mayor and the city council a little later on in the year. That is per our obligation and our authority under Article 4. And so this conversation, this hearing has been vital to us making sure that we meet our obligation and do our part to support the agencies and the good teams in the agencies that do good work on behalf of the city. With that, we have had a good time tonight. I hope everybody remains healthy and well. It is 8:09. If there's nothing else, Director Ryer, you're good. Your team is good. Great job tonight. Thank you very much. With that, this hearing is adjourned.